Chapter 1. The Invitation to Willow Cottage. The late autumn rain pattered against the windows of St. Mary Mead's modest vicarage, where Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. A cup of tea steamed on the table beside her, and the room was filled with the comforting scent of lavender and old books. It was a perfectly ordinary evening, until the post arrived. Her housekeeper, Florence, bustled in, clutching a single envelope. "This came for you, Miss Marple. Odd thing, it's got no return address." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her sharp eyes gleaming with curiosity. The envelope was of fine cream paper, sealed with a wax stamp bearing a curious emblem, a sprig of rosemary entwined with a serpent. She opened it with care, revealing a letter written in elegant looping script. "Dear Miss Marple, your reputation for discernment precedes you. I humbly invite you to Willow Cottage near the village of Blackthorn for an exclusive dessert tasting on the evening of November 12th. I, Clara Vane, have crafted a recipe unlike any other. A dessert that tells a story. Few are worthy to experience it. I trust you will not decline. Yours sincerely, Clara Vane." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The letter was polite, yet there was an undercurrent of something peculiar. Clara Vane was unknown to her, and Blackthorn, a remote village some miles away, was not a place she frequented. The absence of a return address, and the cryptic mention of a dessert that tells a story, stirred her instincts. "Florence," she said, folding the letter, "do you know of a Clara Vane?" Florence shook her head. "Never heard the name, miss. Sounds like one of those fancy London types, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I think this is no ordinary invitation." The next morning she made discreet inquiries at the village post office and the local tea shop, but no one knew of Clara Vane or Willow Cottage. Her nephew, Raymond West, happened to telephone that afternoon, and she mentioned the invitation. "In passing. Sounds like a lark, Aunt Jane," Raymond said, his voice crackling through the line. "Probably some eccentric chef looking to make a name for herself. You're not actually going, are you?" "I believe I shall," Miss Marple replied calmly. "There's something about this letter that intrigues me. Besides, a dessert tasting in a quiet village sounds rather charming." Raymond chuckled. "You'll probably uncover a scandal over the pudding. Do be careful." On the evening of November 12th, Miss Marple boarded a train to Blackthorn, her small suitcase packed, with essentials and her mind alight with questions. The journey was uneventful, but the station at Blackthorn was little more than a platform shrouded in mist. A driver awaited her, a taciturn man in a dark coat who introduced himself as Mr. Harrow. He led her to a horse-drawn carriage, an unusual choice in these modern times, and they set off toward Willow Cottage. The road wound through dense woods, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. At last, the carriage stopped before a quaint, ivy-covered cottage, its windows glowing with warm light. As Miss Marple stepped down, she noted the isolation of the place. No other houses in sight, only the whisper of the wind through the trees. The door opened, and a woman appeared, her auburn hair pinned neatly, her smile both welcoming and guarded. "Miss Marple, I presume. I'm Clara Vane. Welcome to Willow Cottage." Miss Marple returned the smile, her eyes taking in every detail. Clara's poised demeanour, the faint tremor in her hand, the rosemary sprig pinned to her dress. "Thank you, Miss Vane. I'm most curious about your dessert." Clara's smile tightened ever so slightly. "Oh, it's more than a dessert. It's a secret, one I hope you'll help me unravel." As Miss Marple crossed the threshold, a shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from the unmistakable sense that this evening would be anything but ordinary. "Detective, where are you solving from? Drop your location below. Want more chilling? Cases. Subscribe. Tomorrow's mystery gets darker. Stay sharp." Chapter 2. The Guests Assemble. The interior of Willow Cottage was as charming as its exterior, with polished wooden floors, a crackling fire, and walls adorned with botanical sketches. Miss Marple followed Clara Vane into a cosy dining room where a long oak table was set for 7. Crystal glasses gleamed under a chandelier, and a faint aroma of vanilla and spice hung in the air. 5 other guests were already present, their voices hushed as they glanced at the new arrival. Clara gestured to an empty chair. "Miss Marple, please, take a seat. We're only waiting for one more." Miss Marple settled into her chair, her eyes discreetly studying the company. Her knack for observing human nature, honed over years in St. Mary Mead, told her this was no ordinary gathering. Each guest seemed to carry an invisible weight, their politeness tinged with wariness. To her left sat Dr. Lionel Gray, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks. He introduced himself as a botanist, his voice clipped and precise. "I study rare plants," he said, though his eyes darted away when Miss Marple asked if he'd visited Blackthorn before. Across from her was Mrs. Evelyn Carver, a widow in her late 50s, draped in a velvet shawl. Her fingers toyed with a locket around her neck, and her conversation was laced with vague references to better days. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands. Grief, perhaps, or something more. Next to Mrs. Carver was Mr. Felix Durant, a young journalist with a sharp jawline and an even sharper tongue. He leaned back in his chair, scribbling in a notebook. His questions to Clara about her dessert met with evasive smiles. "I smell a story here," he muttered loud, enough for Miss Marple to hear. Then there was Miss Sophie Lang, a quiet young woman with striking green eyes and a habit of glancing at the door. She claimed to be an artist, sketching herbs for a botanical journal, but her hands were ink-free, and her dress was too fine for a struggling painter. Miss Marple wondered what she was hiding. The 5th guest, Colonel Rupert Blaine, was a retired military man with a booming voice and a penchant for whiskey. His anecdotes about his days in India were hearty, but his gaze lingered on Clara with an intensity that belied his jovial demeanour. Clara stood at the head of the table, her composure flawless as she poured wine. "You're all here because you appreciate the extraordinary," she said. "Tonight you'll taste something unforgettable." Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on her napkin. "And how did you choose us, Miss Vane? We seem a rather eclectic group." Clara's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say I have a knack for finding those who belong at this table." Before Miss Marple could press further, the door creaked open and the final guest arrived. Mr. Thomas Wren, a gaunt man in his 40s, entered with an apologetic nod. His coat was damp from the rain, and his eyes were shadowed as though he hadn't slept in days. "Forgive my tardiness," he murmured, taking the last seat. With everyone assembled, Clara clapped her hands. "Wonderful! Now, let me tell you about the dessert. It's an old recipe, one my family guarded for generations. They called it Rosemary's Lament. Beautiful, perilous, and never to be shared lightly." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The rosemary sprig on Clara's dress, the emblem on the invitation. Rosemary was no coincidence. She watched the guests' reactions. Dr. Gray's fingers froze on his cufflinks. Mrs. Carver's locket snapped shut, and Felix Durant's pencil paused mid-scribble. Something about the name Rosemary's Lament had struck a nerve. As Clara disappeared into the kitchen, promising to return with the dessert, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind already weaving connections. These strangers were not strangers to each other, or to the secret Clara was about to unveil. The fire crackled, casting shadows across the table, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle taking shape. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Recipe. The dining room of Willow Cottage grew quiet as Clara Vane returned, carrying a silver tray that gleamed under the chandelier's light. On it sat a single dessert, a delicate tiered confection that looked like a cross between a tart and a soufflé, its surface dusted with powdered sugar and studded with tiny candied rosemary leaves. The aroma was intoxicating, sweet, herbal, and faintly earthy, with a hint of something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Clara set the tray at the centre of the table, her eyes glinting with a mix of pride and secrecy. "This," she announced, "is Rosemary's Lament. A recipe passed down through my family for over a century, said to be cursed by its creator. It's never been served to outsiders until tonight." Miss Marple's gaze flicked from the dessert to the guests. Colonel Blaine's hearty chuckle broke the silence. "Cursed, you say? Sounds like a fine story to go with a fine dish." Clara's smile was tight. "It's more than a story, Colonel. The recipe's creator, my great-great-aunt Rosemary Vane, swore it would bring ruin to anyone who tasted it unworthily. She was eccentric, but her warning has been heeded by my family ever since." Felix Durant, the journalist, leaned forward, his notebook open. "Ruin, eh? Care to share the details? My readers love a good curse." Clara hesitated, her fingers brushing the rosemary sprig pinned to her dress. Rosemary Vane was a herbalist, revered and feared in Blackthorn. She crafted this dessert for a private gathering in 1847. The guests, 7 like us, were chosen carefully. By morning, 3 were dead, and the rest vanished. The recipe was locked away, deemed too dangerous to recreate. Mrs. Carver's locket clicked open and shut, her voice trembling. "And yet you've made it. Why now?" Clara's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "Because I believe the curse is a lie, a story to hide a truth. I want to break its hold, and you're here to help me prove it." Dr. Gray adjusted his spectacles, his tone sceptical. "A dessert can't kill, Miss Vane. Poison, perhaps, but that's no curse." "Perhaps," Clara said softly, "but the ingredients are unusual. Some are rare, others forbidden in modern kitchens. I've followed the recipe exactly, as Rosemary did. Miss Sophie Lang, the artist, spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. Forbidden? Like what?" Clara's lips curved. "Patience, Miss Lang. You'll taste it soon enough." Miss Marple watched the exchange, her knitting, needles idle in her lap. The guests' reactions were telling. Felix's eager curiosity, Sophie's quiet dread, Mrs. Carver's unease, Colonel Blaine's forced bravado, Dr. Gray's scientific detachment, and Mr. Wren's silent, haunted stare. Each seemed to know more than they let on, and Clara's cryptic words only deepened the tension. Clara began slicing the dessert, her movements precise. "One piece for each of us," she said, placing a portion on a porcelain plate. "No one is to taste it until we all raise our forks together." "Agreed." The guests nodded, some reluctantly. Miss Marple accepted her plate, studying the dessert closely. The texture was light, almost airy, with flecks of green. Rosemary, perhaps, and a faint shimmer, as if an unusual ingredient had been folded into the batter. Her mind raced, recalling tales of poisonous herbs and alchemical concoctions. Rosemary itself was harmless, but paired with the right or wrong companion, it could be deadly. As Clara took her seat, she raised her fork, her voice solemn, to truth and to breaking the curse of Rosemary's lament. The others followed suit, their forks hovering over their plates. Miss Marple's eyes darted around the table, catching a flicker of hesitation in Mr. Wren's grip, a bead of sweat on Dr. Gray's brow. Something was amiss, but before she could speak, Clara gave the signal. "Now!" Forks descended, and the room filled with the soft clink of silver against porcelain. Miss Marple took a tiny bite, letting the flavours unfold. Sweet cream, sharp, rosemary, a bitter undertone. She swallowed carefully, her senses alert. For a moment, all was still. Then Mr. Wren gasped, his fork clattering to the table, his face flushed red, his hands clutching his throat as he slumped forward. Motionless, chaos erupted. Mrs. Carver screamed, Felix leapt to his feet, and Colonel Blaine roared for a doctor. Clara stood frozen, her eyes wide with horror. Or was it something else? Miss Marple remained seated, her heart steady. The curse, it seemed, was no mere story, and she was determined to uncover the truth before Rosemary's lament claimed another victim. Chapter 4. A Taste of Danger. The dining room of Willow Cottage descended into pandemonium. Mrs. Carver's screams echoed off the walls. Felix Durant shouted for water, and Colonel Blaine knelt beside Mr. Wren, who lay slumped over the table, his face an alarming shade of crimson. Dr. Gray, the botanist, pushed through the chaos, his spectacles slipping as he checked Wren's pulse. Miss Sophie Lang stood frozen, her green eyes wide with shock, while Clara Vane remained at the head of the table, her hands gripping the edge, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, seated calmly, observed every detail. Her small bite of Rosemary's lament had left a bitter aftertaste, but she felt no ill effects. Yet her mind was already at work, cataloguing the scene. Wren's sudden collapse, the timing of his symptoms, the reactions of the others. This was no accident, she was certain. "Pulse is weak but present," Dr. Gray announced, loosening Wren's collar. "He's breathing barely. We need to get him to a hospital." "No hospital nearby," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Blackthorn's too remote. There's a telephone in the hall. Call for a doctor." Felix darted out, his journalist instincts kicking in. while Colonel Blaine hoisted Wren's limp form onto a nearby sofa. Miss Marple rose, her movements unobtrusive, and approached the dessert tray. The remaining slices of Rosemary's Lament sat untouched, their candied rosemary leaves glinting like tiny emeralds. She leaned closer, noting a faint, acrid scent. Beneath the sweetness, something unnatural. "Miss Vane," she said softly, turning to Clara, "what exactly is in this dessert?" Clara's eyes flicked to the tray, then back to Miss Marple. "Cream, sugar, rosemary, a few rare herbs. Nothing harmful, I assure you." "Nothing harmful?" Mrs. Carver snapped, her locket clutched tightly. "That man is half dead." "Perhaps an allergic reaction," Dr. Gray offered, though his tone lacked conviction. He glanced at Clara, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Allergies didn't explain the speed of Wren's collapse, nor the acrid scent she detected. She recalled her village doctor's tales of poisons, some fast-acting, others subtle. This felt deliberate, targeted. But why Wren, and why now? Felix returned, breathless. "Doctor's on his way, but it'll be an hour. The storm's worsening." Colonel Blaine cursed under his breath. "We can't just sit here. If that dessert's poisoned, we've all had a bite." "Not all of us," Miss Sophie Lang murmured, her plate untouched. She shrank under the sudden scrutiny, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Sophie. The young woman's refusal to eat was telling, but so was Clara's, calm amidst the chaos. And then there was the dessert itself. Only Wren's slice had triggered a reaction. A selective poison, perhaps, or tampering. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "might I see the kitchen where you prepared this dessert?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, but I assure you, I followed the recipe precisely." The kitchen was a contrast to the dining room's warmth. Stone walls, a cavernous hearth, and shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and spices. A workbench held the remnants of Clara's preparations. Bowls, whisks, and a small vial of dark liquid, its label illegible. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the vial, but she said nothing, merely noting its presence. As Clara explained her process, Miss Marple listened, her mind elsewhere. Wren's collapse had shifted the dynamic among the guests. Fear now mingled with suspicion, and she sensed hidden connections between them, like threads waiting to be unravelled. The rosemary sprig on Clara's dress, the emblem on the invitation, the name Rosemary's Lament, all pointed to a deeper story, one tied to the past. Back in the dining room, Dr. Gray was administering water to Wren, who stirred faintly, his breathing shallow. The other guests hovered, their earlier civility fraying. Felix scribbled furiously in his notebook. Mrs. Carver murmured prayers, and Colonel Blaine paced, his face flushed with anger. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. The dessert was the key, but so was Wren. Why had he been targeted? What did he know or possess that made him a threat? And Clara, with her poised demeanour and cryptic hints, was she victim, orchestrator, or something else entirely? As the storm raged outside, Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes scanning the room. The doctor would arrive soon, but she suspected the truth would not wait. The curse of Rosemary's Lament was unfolding, and she was determined to stop it before it claimed another life. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Past. The storm battered Willow Cottage, rattling windows and casting eerie shadows across the dining room. Mr. Wren lay on the sofa, his breathing shallow but steadier, thanks to Dr. Gray's efforts. The other guests sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between the untouched dessert tray and each other. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, seemed the calmest of all, though her mind was a whirlwind of connections and questions. The telephone call had confirmed the doctor's delay. Muddy roads and fallen branches made Blackthorn nearly inaccessible. With time to spare, Miss Marple turned her attention to Clara Vane, who stood by the fire, her auburn hair glowing in the flickering light. The rosemary sprig on her dress was a constant reminder of the dessert's name, Rosemary's Lament, and its supposed curse. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but deliberate, "you mentioned your great-great-aunt, Rosemary Vane, and the tragedy of 1847. Might you share more? It seems relevant." Clara's fingers tightened around her wine-glass, but she nodded. "Very well. It's an old story, one my family rarely speaks of." She took a breath, her gaze distant. Rosemary Vane was a herbalist, gifted but eccentric. She lived here, in this very cottage, and was known for her remedies and her secrets. In 1847, she invited 7 guests to taste her masterpiece, a dessert she claimed could reveal truths. By morning, 3 were dead, poisoned, and the others fled Blackthorn, never to return. Felix Durant's pencil scratched across his notebook. "Poisoned by the dessert?" "So the story goes," Clara replied. "The villagers called it a curse, said Rosemary had tampered with the recipe out of spite. She was shunned and died alone here a year later. The recipe was locked in a family vault, untouched until I found it." Mrs. Carver's locket snapped shut. "And you thought it wise to recreate it, knowing its history?" Clara's eyes flashed. "I wanted to prove the curse was nonsense, a scapegoat for human error or malice. I studied the recipe, sourced every ingredient carefully. I thought—" Her voice faltered. "I thought it was safe." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind latched onto Clara's words. Human error or malice, the distinction was crucial. She glanced at Mr. Wren, still unconscious, and recalled the acrid scent of his dessert slice. Poison, yes, but not necessarily in every portion. Someone had targeted him specifically. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple continued, "do you know who those 7 guests were in 1847? Their names, perhaps?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "The records are vague. My family destroyed most of Rosemary's papers to bury the scandal. I only know they were prominent figures. A doctor, a merchant, a soldier, people of influence." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A doctor, a soldier, echoes of Dr. Gray and Colonel Blaine. Coincidence, perhaps, but in her experience, coincidences were often clues in disguise. She turned to the others. "And you, all of you, had you heard of Rosemary Vane before tonight?" A chorus of denials followed, some too quick. Dr. Gray adjusted his cufflinks. Sophie Lang stared at her untouched plate, and Colonel Blaine's whisky glass paused mid-air. Felix Durant, however, leaned forward. "I dug into Blackthorns," History for a story once. Heard whispers of a witch who poisoned her guests. Didn't know her name until now. Miss Marple nodded, filing away his admission. Felix's research could be useful, or a convenient cover. She needed more information, something tangible. Rising, she addressed Clara. "Might I see where you found the recipe? A family vault, you said?" Clara led her to a small study off the dining room, its walls lined with dusty books and faded portraits. A locked iron box sat on a desk, its lid now open. Inside was a single parchment, yellowed with age, the recipe for Rosemary's Lament, written in a spidery hand. Miss Marple scanned it, noting ingredients like essence of night bloom and tears of oleander, cryptic terms that could mask dangerous substances. As Clara explained how she deciphered the recipe, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to the portraits. One caught her attention. A stern woman with auburn hair, a rosemary sprig tucked into her shawl, her eyes eerily similar to Clara's. The frame bore a name, Rosemary Vane, 1845, but it was the portrait beside it that made Miss Marple pause. A group of 7, their faces sombre, standing before Willow Cottage. The caption read, Blackthorn Gathering, 1847. She studied their features, searching for resemblances to the guests in the dining room. A faint familiarity tugged at her, too vague to pinpoint, but enough to deepen her suspicion. Back in the dining room, Wren stirred, mumbling incoherently. Dr. Gray bent over him, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance between him and Clara, brief, but laden with meaning. The past was not as distant as it seemed, and the tragedy of 1847 was entwined with the present. Someone in this room knew more about Rosemary Vane's curse and Mr. Wren's collapse than they admitted. As the storm howled outside, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her mind weaving a tapestry of motives and secrets. The recipe was the key, but its true danger lay not in its ingredients, but in the hands that had prepared it tonight. Chapter 6. The Hidden Ingredient. The fire in Willow Cottage's dining room had dwindled to embers, casting a dim glow over the tense gathering. Mr. Wren, though still pale and disoriented, had been moved to a chair, his eyes fluttering as he sipped water under Dr. Gray's watchful gaze. The other guests hovered, their earlier shock giving way to suspicion. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded, her mind dissecting the events like a puzzle with a missing piece. The dessert tray remained on the table, its slices of Rosemary's Lament now a silent accusation. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the recipe she'd seen in the study. Essence of night bloom, tears of oleander. Cryptic, yes, but her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that old recipes often cloaked dangerous substances in poetic names. Oleander, for instance, was a deadly plant, its sap capable of stopping a heart. Could it be the culprit? She turned to Dr. Gray, who was adjusting his spectacles as he monitored Wren. Dr. Gray, as a botanist, you must be familiar with oleander. Is it possible it was used in the dessert? The room stilled. Dr. Gray's fingers froze on his cufflinks, his expression guarded. Oleander. Highly toxic, yes, but unlikely in a dessert. Its bitterness would be noticeable, and the symptoms, he glanced at Wren, would be more violent. And yet, Miss Marple pressed gently, Mr. Wren's collapse was swift, What might cause such a reaction, in your expert opinion?" Dr. Gray hesitated, then shrugged. "Aconite, perhaps, or belladonna. Both are fast-acting and could be masked in a sweet dish. But I'd need to analyse the dessert to be sure." Clara Vane, standing by the fireplace, bristled. "I used no such thing. The recipe called for rare herbs, yes, but I sourced them from reputable suppliers. I tasted the dessert myself." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "and you're quite well, as am I, which suggests Mr. Wren's portion was unique." The implication hung in the air. Felix Durant's pencil scratched furiously, while Mrs. Carver's locket clicked open and shut. Colonel Blaine, his face flushed from whisky, growled, "You're saying someone poisoned his slice? One of us?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It's a possibility, Colonel. The dessert was prepared in the kitchen, but served here. Ample opportunity for tampering." Sophie Lang, who had barely spoken, shifted uncomfortably. But why him? Why Mr. Wren? A good question, Miss Marple thought. She studied Wren, who was now coherent enough to mutter, I didn't know." His voice trailed off. His eyes haunted. What didn't he know? And why had it made him a target? Determined to find answers, Miss Marple rose. "Miss Vane, might I examine the kitchen again? The ingredients, in particular?" Clara nodded, though her reluctance was palpable. The kitchen was as Miss Marple remembered. Stone walls, herb-filled jars, and the workbench cluttered with bowls and utensils. The small vial of dark liquid she'd noticed earlier was still there, tucked behind a mortar and pestle. She picked it up, holding it to the light. The label, faded but legible, read, "Tincture of Night Bloom." "Miss Vane," she said, "what is this?" Clara's face paled. "It's part of the recipe. A distillate of a rare flower, used sparingly for flavour. It's harmless in small doses." "Harmless?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle but probing. "And who handled this vial during preparation?" "Only me," Clara insisted. "I measured it myself, drop by drop." Miss Marple set the vial down, her mind racing. Night bloom wasn't a term she recognised, but Dr. Gray might. She made a mental note to ask him, discreetly. For now, she examined the other ingredients. Dried rosemary, powdered sugar, a jar labelled sylvan root. Nothing overtly suspicious, yet the possibility of substitution or contamination loomed large. As they returned to the dining room, Wren was speaking, his voice weak but urgent. "The letter. It mentioned my father." He clutched Dr. Gray's arm, then slumped back, exhausted. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A letter? Like her own invitation, perhaps. She approached Wren, her voice soothing. "Mr. Wren, what did your letter say about your father?" He blinked, disoriented. "It said he knew Rosemary Vane, that I'd learn the truth here. I thought it was nonsense." The room tensed. Felix stopped writing, his eyes narrowing. Mrs. Carver gasped, and Sophie Lang's hands twisted in her lap. Clara's expression was unreadable, but her fingers brushed the rosemary sprig on her dress. A nervous gesture, Miss Marple noted. The mention of Wren's father, tied to Rosemary Vane, was a thread she couldn't ignore. The hidden ingredient in Rosemary's lament wasn't just a poison. It was a motive, rooted in a past that connected Wren, Clara, and perhaps others in the room. As the storm raged outside, Miss Marple resolved to tug that thread until the truth unravelled. Chapter 7. Shadows in the Kitchen. The storm's ferocity had not abated, its howls mingling with the crackle of the fire in Willow Cottage. Mr. Wren, though weak, was stable, propped up on the sofa with Dr. Gray monitoring him closely. The other guests sat in strained silence, their glances flickering between the dessert tray and each other. Miss Marple, her demeanour as composed as ever, felt the weight of the evening's revelations. Wren's mention of his father and a letter tying him to Rosemary Vane had shifted the puzzle, but the pieces were still scattered. Her thoughts returned to the kitchen, where the vial of tincture of night bloom and the possibility of tampering lingered. The poison, if it was poison, had been precise, affecting only Wren's slice. That suggested opportunity and intent, but who had both? She needed to investigate further, away from prying eyes. As midnight approached, the guests began to retire to their rooms, exhausted by the ordeal. Clara, ever the hostess, offered to stay with Wren until the doctor arrived. Miss Marple seized the moment. "Miss Vane," she said, "I'll fetch a blanket for Mr. Wren. The kitchen passage leads to the linen closet, doesn't it?" Clara nodded, distracted. "Yes, through the back door, second shelf on the right." Miss Marple slipped into the kitchen, her steps light. The room was dark now, lit only by a sliver of moonlight through the window. She bypassed the linen closet and moved to the workbench, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. The vial of tincture of night bloom was still there, but something new caught her attention. A faint smudge of powder on the counter near the mortar and pestle. She touched it lightly, rubbing it between her fingers. It was gritty, unlike the powdered sugar used in the dessert. Kneeling, she examined the floor beneath the workbench. A tiny shard of glass glinted in the moonlight, barely larger than a grain of rice. She retrieved her handkerchief and carefully collected it, tucking it into her pocket. Glass suggested a broken vial or container, perhaps the source of the poison. As she stood, a shadow moved in the doorway. Miss Marple froze, her heart steady but alert. The figure hesitated, then stepped into the moonlight. Sophie Lang, her green eyes wide with apprehension. "Miss Marple," Sophie whispered, "what are you doing here?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I might ask you the same, Miss Lang. Trouble sleeping?" Sophie's hands twisted together. I couldn't stay in my room. Not after what happened. I thought I'd look around, see if there was anything suspicious." "Suspicious," Miss Marple echoed, her tone gentle but probing. "And what did you hope to find?" Sophie glanced at the workbench, then away. "I don't know. Something to explain why Mr. Wren was poisoned." "You think it was poison, don't you?" Miss Marple studied her. Sophie's nervousness was genuine, but her presence in the kitchen at this hour was no coincidence. "I think someone meant Mr. Wren harm," she said carefully. "And I think you know more than you've shared. Your plate was untouched tonight." "Why?" Sophie's face paled. I wasn't hungry, that's all." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice held a quiet firmness. "Miss Lang, if you know something, it's best to speak now. Secrets have a way of turning dangerous." Before Sophie could respond, a creak echoed from the dining room. Both Women turned, but no one appeared. Sophie backed away, her voice trembling. "I should go. Please don't tell anyone you saw me." She fled, leaving Miss Marple alone. The creak suggested another presence, someone watching from the shadows. She moved to the dining room, but it was empty, the dessert tray still on the table. Wren's slice now cold and congealed. She examined it closely, noting a faint discoloration at its edge, subtle but distinct from the other portions. Returning to the kitchen, she opened a few jars, sniffing their contents. The sylvan root jar had a sharp, unfamiliar odour, unlike the earthy scents of the others. She recalled Dr. Gray's mention of aconite, a poison derived from roots. Could sylvan root be a euphemism? As she closed the jar, a memory surfaced. The portrait in the study, the 7 guests of 1847. One had resembled Wren. A familial likeness, perhaps. If Wren's father knew Rosemary Vane, he might have been among those guests or connected to their fate. The poison tonight could be an echo of that long-ago tragedy. A vendetta revived. Miss Marple slipped the handkerchief with the glass shard into her bag and retrieved a blanket from the linen closet, maintaining her cover. As she returned to the dining room, Clara looked up, her eyes weary. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You're very kind." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. But her mind was far from kind. It was sharp, relentless, piecing together the shadows in the kitchen and the secrets they concealed. Someone had tampered with Wren's dessert, and Sophie's midnight wanderings suggested she knew more than she admitted. The doctor's arrival would bring answers, but Miss Marple suspected the real truth lay closer, hidden in the cottage's dark corners. Chapter 8. The Motive Unravelled. The storm had eased to a restless drizzle, but the air in Willow Cottage remained, thick with tension. Mr. Wren, now semi-conscious, murmured incoherently on the sofa, while Dr. Gray hovered, his scientific detachment fraying. The other guests lingered in the dining room, their faces etched with suspicion and fatigue. Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes flitting from one to another, her mind weaving the threads of the night's events into a coherent pattern. The glass, shard in her handkerchief, the discoloured edge of Wren's dessert, Sophie Lang's midnight prowling, and the cryptic sylvan root, all pointed to deliberate poisoning. But the why eluded her. Wren's mention of his father and Rosemary Vane suggested a motive rooted in the past, yet the guests' connections to that 1847 tragedy were still murky. She needed to probe deeper, and the doctor's delayed arrival gave her time. Miss Marple turned to Clara, who stood by the window, her rosemary sprig glinting in the dim light. "Miss Vane, you said the 1847 guests were prominent figures. A doctor, a soldier, a merchant. Have you any records of their names? It might shed light on Mr. Wren's misfortune." Clara's lips tightened, but she nodded. "There's an old ledger in the study. I'll fetch it." As Clara left, Miss Marple addressed the group, her voice gentle but deliberate. "It's curious, isn't it? Mr. Wren's letter mentioned his father and Rosemary Vane. I wonder if any of you received similar invitations, ones hinting at personal connections to this cottage's history." The room stilled. Felix Durant's pencil paused, his eyes narrowing. "My invite just said I'd get a scoop. Nothing about family." Mrs. Carver clutched her locket. Mine mentioned my late husband. It said he'd want me to come. I thought it was odd, but I was curious. Colonel Blaine snorted, swirling his whiskey. Mine called me a man of honour who'd face the curse. Damned flattery, but it worked. Dr. Gray adjusted his cufflinks, his tone clipped. Mine referenced my work with rare plants. Said I'd appreciate the recipe's uniqueness. Sophie Lang, pale and silent, stared at her hands. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her. "And you, Miss Lang?" Sophie's voice was barely audible. "It mentioned my mother. Said she'd been here once. I didn't believe it, but I had to know." Miss Marple's mind raced. Each invitation was tailored, drawing the guests with personal lures. Someone had researched their histories, their families, and their ties, however faint, to Rosemary Vane's era. Wren's father, Mrs. Carver's husband, Sophie's mother. The 1847 gathering was the key, and the ledger might confirm it. Clara returned, clutching a leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. She opened it to a faded entry dated 1847, listing 7 names: Dr. Elias Gray, Captain Rupert Blaine, Merchant Thomas Carver, Herbalist Margaret Lang, Solicitor Edmund Wren, Lady Beatrice Durant, and Reverend Simon Root. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The surnames matched the guests, save for Felix Durant, whose ancestor was a woman, and the mysterious Reverend Root. "Remarkable," Miss Marple murmured. "It seems your ancestors were Rosemary's guests or closely connected, and now you're here, repeating history." Dr. Gray's face paled. "My great-grandfather. Impossible. He never mentioned this place, nor did my father," Colonel Blaine growled. "But he was a soldier, like this Captain Blaine. Could be him." Mrs. Carver's locket fell open, revealing a tiny portrait. "Thomas, my husband's grandfather was a merchant. He died young, poisoned, they said." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "My mother. She was adopted, but her birth name was Lang. She never spoke of her past." Felix leaned forward, his journalist's instinct flaring. "So what? Someone's recreating 1847? Poisoning us like our ancestors?" Miss Marple's eyes met Wren's, who stirred, his voice weak. "My father warned me about Blackthorn. Said it was cursed." The motive was taking shape. Revenge, perhaps, or a reckoning for sins of the past. But who had orchestrated this? Clara, with her intimate knowledge of the recipe. Or another guest, hiding their true purpose. The sylvan root jar nagged at her. Reverend Simon Root's name in the ledger was no coincidence. Could the poison be tied to him? She addressed Clara. "Miss Vane, the sylvan root in your kitchen. Where did you source it?" Clara frowned. "A local supplier. It's just a flavouring, like anise." "Or aconite," Miss Marple said softly, watching Clara's reaction. "Known as monkshood, or the devil's root. Deadly in small doses." Clara's hand flew to her rosemary sprig. A nervous tick. I'd never used such a thing. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. The ledger, the invitations, the poison, all pointed to a plan, and Clara's role was ambiguous. As the guests exchanged wary glances, Miss Marple felt the net tightening. The motive was vengeance, tied to the 1847 deaths. And the killer was among them, waiting to strike again. Chapter 9. The Final Serving. The dining room of Willow Cottage was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire and the distant patter of rain. Mr. Wren, though frail, was alert enough to follow the conversation, his haunted eyes fixed on the ledger that lay open on the table. The names of the 1847 guests, ancestors or kin to those present, had cast a chilling shadow over the group. Miss Marple, her hands folded calmly, felt the puzzle nearing its climax. The motive was vengeance, tied to a tragedy long buried, but the killer's identity remained elusive. Clara Vane, her composure fraying, announced she would prepare tea to steady everyone's nerves. "Something simple," she said, her voice strained. "No recipes, no risks." But as she moved toward the kitchen, Miss Marple's instincts flared. Another dessert, another chance for poison. Clara's offer, however innocent, could be a ruse. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, rising, "might I assist you? I'm rather particular about my tea." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." The kitchen was dim, the storm's aftermath leaving the air damp and heavy. As Clara filled a kettle, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the workbench. The sylvan root jar was still there, its sharp odour lingering in her memory. She recalled the ledger's final name, Reverend Simon Root, and the glass shard she'd found, evidence of tampering. The poison, likely aconite, had been added to Wren's slice. But the killer might strike again, especially with the doctor still delayed. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "The ledger mentioned a Reverend Simon Root. Any relation to your family, perhaps?" Clara's hand faltered on the kettle. "No, the name's unfamiliar. My family only spoke of rosemary." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind churned. Clara's nervous tics, the rosemary sprig, her guarded responses, suggested she knew more. Yet the other guests had motives too. Dr. Gray's botanical expertise, Sophie's secretive prowling, Felix's probing questions. Each could have slipped poison into Wren's dessert, driven by a vendetta tied to their ancestors' fates. As Clara prepared the tea, Miss Marple devised a plan. The killer needed to be exposed before another serving claimed a life. She returned to the dining room, where the guests sat in uneasy vigil. Wren, now sitting upright, clutched a glass of water, his voice hoarse. "It was the letter. It said my father betrayed her." "Betrayed who?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Rosemary," Wren whispered. He was there in 1847. He survived, but she didn't forgive." The pieces clicked. The 1847 poisoning wasn't just a tragedy. It was a betrayal, perhaps a conspiracy among the survivors. Wren's father, Solicitor Edmund Wren, had lived, but at what cost? And who sought revenge now? Miss Marple addressed the group, her voice steady. "I believe our host has been selective with the truth. But so have others. The poison in Mr. Wren's dessert was no accident, and it was meant to punish a descendant of those who wronged Rosemary Vane. We must act before the killer tries again." Felix's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Clara poisoned him?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, "but someone did, and they're here." She turned to Clara, who entered with a tray of teacups. "Miss Vane, might we examine the tea before it's served, just to be safe?" Clara's face tightened, but she set the tray down. Miss Marple leaned over, sniffing each cup. One had a faint, acrid scent, subtle but unmistakable. She lifted it, holding it to the light. "This cup," she said, "has been tampered with. Aconite, I suspect, like Mr. Wren's dessert." Chaos erupted. Colonel Blaine roared, "Who's it for?" Mrs. Carver shrank back, and Sophie gasped. Dr. Gray's cufflinks clicked nervously, while Felix leapt up, notebook forgotten. Miss Marple's gaze locked on Sophie Lang, whose hands trembled. "Miss Lang, you were in the kitchen last night near the Sylvan Root, and your mother, Margaret Lang, was among Rosemary's guests. Did she pass down a grudge?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. The letter said my mother was betrayed, that Wren's father caused her death. I only wanted justice." She collapsed, sobbing, as Clara lunged forward, her rosemary sprig falling to the floor. You poisoned my dessert." Miss Marple raised a hand. "Miss Lang acted, but she wasn't alone. Miss Vane, your invitations drew these descendants here, knowing their histories. You wanted the truth exposed, didn't you? But you didn't expect a killer among them." Clara's shoulders sagged. I suspected someone might try. That's why I invited you, Miss Marple, to see what I couldn't." The room fell silent, Sophie's confession hanging heavy. Miss Marple's trap had worked. The tainted tea, a bluff based on the acrid scent she'd fabricated, had flushed out the culprit. Sophie, driven by an inherited vendetta, had used her access to the kitchen to poison Wren's dessert, believing his father's betrayal warranted retribution. As the guests processed the revelation, headlights pierced the window. The doctor had arrived. Miss Marple sighed, her work nearly done. The final serving had been a test, and the truth had prevailed, just in time. Chapter 10. The Recipe's Last Secret. The arrival of Dr. Harrow, a wiry man with a weathered face, brought a flurry of activity to Willow Cottage. He examined Mr. Wren, confirming aconite poisoning, but noting his stabilization thanks to Dr. Gray's quick intervention. Sophie Lang, still trembling from her confession, was escorted to a chair, her tear-streaked face a portrait of remorse. The other guests stood in stunned silence, their suspicions now replaced by the weight of truth. Miss Marple, her demeanour as serene as ever, watched the scene unfold, her mind tying up the final threads of the mystery. Dr. Harrow administered an antidote to Wren and arranged for his transport to a hospital, promising to notify the authorities about Sophie's actions. As he worked, Miss Marple approached Clara Vane, who stood by the fireplace, her auburn hair loose, the rosemary sprig now discarded on the table. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple said softly, "you've been candid about much, but not all. The invitations, the ledger, the recipe. You orchestrated this gathering to unearth a truth, didn't you? But what was it you truly sought?" Clara's eyes met hers, weary but resolute. "You're right, Miss Marple. I didn't tell you everything. The recipe wasn't just cursed, it was a confession. Rosemary Vane didn't poison her guests in 1847. She was betrayed by them, framed for their deaths to cover a scandal." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. "And you believed their descendants might know, or carry, the guilt of that betrayal?" Clara's voice dropped. "My family's records hinted at it. Rosemary's diary, hidden with the recipe, claimed the guests conspired to ruin her. They were after her herbal knowledge, her land, her influence. 3 died that night, but not by her hand. Someone else poisoned the dessert to silence them all. Rosemary took the blame, and her name was cursed. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the ledger, its names etched in faded ink. Edmund Wren, Margaret Lang, and the others. They survived, but at a cost. Their descendants inherited fragments of the story, didn't they? Sophie's mother passed down a tale of betrayal, enough to fuel her vengeance. Clara nodded. I invited them to see if the truth would surface. I didn't expect murder. Miss Marple's eyes softened. You underestimated the power of old wounds. Sophie's act was her own, but you gave her the stage. The room grew quiet as Dr. Harrow prepared to leave with Wren. Sophie, now composed, spoke, her voice hollow. My mother's letters said Margaret Lang loved Rosemary, but Edmund Wren turned the others against her. He wanted her recipes for profit. I thought his son deserved to pay. Miss Marple turned to Wren, who sat upright, his face pale but alert. Mr. Wren, your father's warning about Blackthorn, was it guilt? Wren's voice was faint. He never spoke of it directly, just said Blackthorn was where he lost his soul. I didn't understand until tonight. The final secret of Rosemary's Lament lay bare. A dessert meant to reveal truths had become a tool of betrayal, then and now. Rosemary Vane's recipe, with its cryptic ingredients, was her coded plea for justice, misunderstood by her heirs and twisted by Sophie's rage. The sylvan root, aconite, as Miss Marple had suspected, wasn't in the original recipe, but added by Sophie, sourced from her own knowledge of herbs, a bitter echo of Rosemary's craft. As the authorities arrived to take Sophie into custody, Miss Marple gathered her things. Felix Durant, his notebook filled, promised a story that would shake Blackthorn to its roots. Though Miss Marple advised discretion, Mrs. Carver, Colonel Blaine, and Dr. Gray departed, their connections to the past now a burden they dare carry silently. Clara approached Miss Marple at the door, her expression bittersweet. You saw what I couldn't, Miss Marple. Thank you, and I'm sorry. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Truth has a way of surfacing, Miss Vane, but it's rarely gentle. Keep Rosemary's diary safe. It's her real legacy. The carriage awaited to take Miss Marple back to the station, the storm now a memory. As Willow Cottage faded into the misty dawn, she reflected on the night's events. Rosemary's Lament was no longer a curse, but a lesson. Secrets, like poisons, fester until exposed. In St. Mary Mead, her knitting awaited, but for now she savoured the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, its final secret laid to rest. Epilogue: The Scent of Rosemary. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled through the countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the whirlwind of the previous night. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, a skein of pale blue wool unspooling in her lap. The mist of Blackthorn had given way to the crisp clarity of a November morning, and the fields beyond the glass sparkled with frost. Yet her mind lingered on Willow Cottage, its secrets, and the bitter aftertaste of Rosemary's Lament. In the days following her departure, news from Blackthorn trickled through. Sophie Lang, remorseful but resolute, had confessed fully to the authorities, her trial pending. The aconite, sourced from a hidden patch of monkshood near her childhood home, was a relic of her mother's herbalist teachings, twisted by a legacy of betrayal. Mr. Wren, recovered but shaken, had returned to London, vowing to uncover more about his father's role in Rosemary Vane's downfall. Felix Durant's article, published in a regional paper, was sensational but tactful, omitting the deeper truths at Miss Marple's gentle urging. Clara Vane, true to her word, preserved Rosemary's diary, turning Willow Cottage into a quiet archive of her ancestor's life. Miss Marple had received a letter from her, brief but heartfelt, enclosing a sprig of dried rosemary. "For remembrance," Clara wrote, "and for justice." Miss Marple tucked the sprig into her prayer book, a reminder of the fine line between vengeance and redemption. Back in St. Mary Mead, the village buzzed with its usual gossip. Mrs. Price's new hat, the vicar's sermon, young Tommy's latest mischief. Miss Marple listened, smiled, and offered her quiet insights. But her thoughts often drifted to Blackthorn. The parallels to her own village were striking, secrets buried beneath civility, old wounds festering in silence. Rosemary Vane, like so many women Miss Marple had known, had been misunderstood, her gifts turned against her by greed and fear. One evening, as she sat by her fire, Florence bustled in with tea. "Heard you had quite the adventure, Miss Marple," she said, setting down the tray. "Poisoned desserts, they say. You're not planning to try that recipe, are you?" Miss Marple chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "No, Florence. Some recipes are best left untasted. But I might try a rosemary scone. Perfectly safe, I assure you." Florence laughed, shaking her head, and left her to her knitting. Miss Marple's needles resumed their dance, each stitch a small act of order in a world prone to chaos. The scent of rosemary lingered in her memory, not as a curse, but as a call to vigilance. People, she knew, were much like recipes, simple on the surface, but capable of hiding dangerous ingredients. And she, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, would always be ready to uncover them. As the fire crackled and the village settled into its evening hush, Miss Marple turned her gaze to the window, where the first stars pierced the twilight. Another mystery solved, another truth laid bare. But the world was full of puzzles, and she had no doubt another would find her soon enough.